Training camp is heating up and RotoBaller has you covered with a look at the top 10 NFL defenses you should target for your fantasy football drafts to kick off the 2026 fantasy football season. Now, when looking at the top defenses, fantasy managers need to find defensive squads that are going to create turnovers, create sacks, and produce on special teams. And it doesn't hurt to have a favorable schedule. With strictly playing the matchups and streaming defenses, it is a tried and true method in the past, but you know what? Sometimes I just like to set it and forget it, and these 10 defenses will allow managers to do just that. At number 10, it's the Baltimore Ravens. Now, depending on how your league scores defenses, Baltimore has been a long coveted top 10 unit. Last season, Baltimore, they finished 19th in fantasy points per game, averaging 5.8 per contest. However, take a look at the numbers inside the numbers. From week 9 on, the Ravens would average 9 fantasy points per game. That was the 4th most over that 9-game period. Baltimore has also one of the best looking secondaries heading into week number 1, led by Marlon Humphrey, Kyle Hampton, Malachi Starks, and Nate Wiggins. But what Baltimore drastically needed was some help and an edge presence. We know they went out there and attempted to get Max Crosby. However, that fell apart. That did not work out for whatever reasons, but they did conveniently sign Trey Hendrickson shortly after that deal fell apart. The addition of Hendrickson will once again legitimize the Ravens' pass rush, coming off a season in which they recorded just 30 sacks. In the last 2 seasons in which Hendrickson was healthy, he recorded 35 sacks alone. At number 9, how about the Minnesota Vikings? It feels somewhat disrespectful having the Vikings this low on the list, considering they are one of 3 teams to average 7.8 fantasy points per game, the 5th highest. Not to mention, Minnesota was 3rd in defensive DVOA, 4th in sacks with 49, and 7th in scoring defense, allowing just 19.6 points per game. Now, Jonathan Greenard moving on in this offseason, that pushes the Vikings a little bit down on this list, but there's still plenty of optimism for this defensive unit. First, Dallas Turner. He is poised for a breakout. Second, how about Caleb Banks adding a presence in the middle of that defensive front? Minnesota, they should be improved on the back end as well. Byron Murphy, he's returning alongside with the new addition, James Pierre. As always, the biggest determining factor is going to be Brian Flores. Flores is among the most aggressive defensive play callers, disrupting opposing quarterbacks with a heavy dose of blitz packages, leading to sacks and turnovers, which fantasy managers love. Philadelphia, they come in at number 8. When healthy, Jalen Carter is an absolute menace to society, anchoring the Eagles' defensive line. Carter is one of the rare true game wreckers who forces offenses to take account for him on every single step. Now, more often than not, quarterbacks find themselves adjusting protection to account for Carter, which leads to more opportunities for his teammates. Last season, Philadelphia finished 3rd in fantasy points, producing 8.2 per contest, and made a couple big-time additions to their defense in the form of Jonathan Greenard and Reek Woolen. Those additions would make up for the losses of N'Kobe Dean, Jalen Phillips, and Reed Blankenship and form a net zero for a team that, in fact, was a top 3 unit last season. Anytime Vic Fangio is calling plays, you have a defense that should be considered among the best the game has to offer. At number 7, how about the Pittsburgh Steelers? Yes, TJ Watt. There, end of conversation. We can stop it right there. But Patrick Graham is also in the conversation as one of the best young defensive coordinators in the game. And Watt and Highsmith, there's also potential for huge scoring weeks. Now, despite Watt missing 3 games last season, the Steelers' defense still managed to average 7.8 fantasy points per game, tied for 5th, thanks in part to 27 forced turnovers, which were the 4th most. Turnovers and sacks, that's where it's at. And not only were the Steelers great at forcing turnovers, but the 48 sacks, that was the 6th most, and that was with Watt missing time. Keep Watt healthy for a full 17 games, and the Steelers easily hit that 50-sack milestone. At number 6, we're going down to Duval County for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They don't ask how, they ask how many. And in fantasy, last season, Jacksonville, they got the job done. Despite ranking 26th in sacks with 22 and outside the top 10 in total yards allowed, they were at 11th at 303.6. Jacksonville finished tied for 3rd in fantasy points per game with 8.2. For the Jaguars, it was a bend but don't break mentality as they had the 8th best scoring defense and an opportunistic defense that forced 31 turnovers, the 2nd most, including 22 interceptions. For fantasy managers, the Jaguars are the biggest boom-bust option inside the top 10. However, it is worth noting that they did produce 8 games with double-digit fantasy production. Now, before we head into the top 5 DSTs, here's a word from our friends at Novig. Hello, ballers! Ahead of the 2026 season, we have teamed up once again with Novig, America's #1 sports prediction market. And it's not your typical sports book. On Novig, you are playing against real users, not the house, on a commission-free exchange, meaning better odds and more control. And we all love more control. Right now, you get $50 when you spend $5 at Novig when you sign up with the code BALLER. That's BALLER. And you'll get 6 months of RotoBaller's Big 4 Premium free. That's picks, projections, and tools that help you stay sharp. Novig's now available nationwide and lets you take the best odds or offer your own. Download the Novig app, use code BALLER, and start playing today. Now, let's get back at it. Here are the top 5 DSTs, starting with the boys in Foxborough, the New England Patriots. It's best not to overthink things in fantasy. Last season, New England had a top 10 defense, one that averaged 7.2 fantasy points per game, and one that arguably got better this offseason thanks to the additions of Kevin Byard, Drummond Jones, and rookie Greg Jackus. New England enters the 2026 season fresh off a Super Bowl performance that was aided by a defense that ranked 4th in scoring at 18.8 and 8th in total yards allowed at 295.2. One area in which New England struggled was by forcing turnovers. They're 19, that sat 21st in the league. That's where Kevin Byard comes in. New England had just 10 interceptions last season, 3 more than Byard did on his own. The strong play in the secondary, especially at that safety position, along with New England's structural discipline, has the Patriots poised once again to be a top 10 defense. At number 4, it's the Denver Broncos. Anytime a team has a former Defensive Player of the Year patrolling their defense, they must be considered amongst the elite. It also doesn't hurt when you have a team that has 173 sacks, including 68 last season, since the start of the 2023 season. The next closest team in that period trails the Broncos by 29. Leading the way once again for the Broncos sack attack will once again be Nick Bonito, who recorded 14 sacks of his own last season. However, he will not be alone. Jonathan Cooper had 8 sacks. John Franklin Myers had 7.5. Zach Allen had 7. These guys are all going to get in the... Well, except for John Franklin Myers, who's no longer there. Denver, they'd be much higher on this list if they were able to force turnovers. While Denver, they did lead the league in sacks, they also finished 2nd in total yards allowed, 279, 3rd in points against at 18.3. But the 14 turnovers, that was amongst the bottom 4 teams in the league last season. Now, we know they're going to get the job done. Vance Joseph has this team as one of the best teams over the last 2 seasons. When we're talking about defensive DVOA, we're talking about a Broncos team that has led the NFL in defensive success rate, rush success rate, EPA per play, and EPA per dropback over the last 2 years. At number 3, how about the Los Angeles Rams? LA can certainly move up this list in the event that Aaron Donald comes out of retirement to anchor what is already considered one of the most dominant defensive fronts in the entire NFL. He's literally flying his speed coach over as I do this video. Now, before the addition of Myles Garrett and his 23 sacks from last season, the Rams, they already bolstered a top 10 sack machine, producing 47 of their own, thanks to Byron Young, Jared Verse, who's now with Kansas City, and Kobe Turner, who all had like 7 sacks of their own to go with it. Los Angeles, they knew they were going to be good up front. They added Myles Garrett, and even before Aaron Donald came in, we knew that this team was going to get the job done. So they went out there and they addressed their secondary. While the Rams lost Kobe Durant, they also added Jalen Watson and Trent McDuffie, who have been longtime staples of a stingy Chiefs secondary. At number 2, how about the Seattle Seahawks? Seattle was the only team last season to average more than 10 fantasy points per game, posting 8 games with 10 or more fantasy points in those 16 contests. Now, Seattle, they also ranked 6th in total defense, allowing 285.6 yards per game. They also finished 10th in passing yards allowed at 193.9, 3rd in rushing yards allowed at 91.9, and they allowed the fewest points scored per game, allowing just 17.2 per contest. Seattle was also top 5 in terms of turnovers forced, and Mike McDonald, you know he's going to be back at it again, as he's going to get his guys tuned in after a dominant 2025 campaign with Byron Murphy II and Devin Witherspoon leading the way. And at number 1, how about the Houston Texans? Only Seattle finished with more fantasy points scored last season than the Texans, who averaged 9.5. Houston is led up front by Will Anderson Jr. and Donnell Hunter, who combined for 27 sacks last season, pushing the Texans' total in that department up to 47. That's 7th most in the league. Sacks are one of the best ways to determine fantasy success, as are turnovers, and only the Bears and the Jaguars created more turnovers than the 29 in which the Texans forced. Pressure up front, along with a secondary led by Derek Stingley Jr., featuring 4 defensive backs who each produced 4 interceptions. Stingley, he was one of the 4. But let's give out some flowers to Jalen Petrie, Kamari Lassiter, and Colin Bullock. Houston also got better this offseason, adding safety Reed Blankenship to that secondary group, along with defensive lineman Logan Hall and rookie Caden McDonald. Now, before we sign off on this show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And for all of the latest news and details, head over to RotoBaller.com. Here are some honorable mention defenses, including the Los Angeles Chargers, Detroit Lions, Cleveland Browns, Green Bay Packers when Michael Parsons returns, the Carolina Panthers if you're looking for a sneaky option, and the Kansas City Chiefs. We'll see you next time.